I really want you to understand the story and the cycles of history and where we are in it so that you're prepared and you're not surprised. So there are three things that are happening in our lifetimes that have never happened before in our lifetimes, but did happen before that. And I needed to study those. And those three things are the amount of debt creation and the printing of money to monetize that debt creation. That's the first, the financial component of what's going on. The second is the amount of internal conflict, populism of the left and right causing a lot of conflict due to large wealth and values gaps. And the third thing is the rise of a great power to challenge the existing great power and the existing world order.
The Fragile Foundation's Economic Growth versus Reality. To truly understand where we are today, we need to reflect on the lessons of 2008. Back then, the global economy appeared robust. The housing market was booming. People were securing mortgages with ease, and Wall Street was celebrating unprecedented profits. But beneath the surface, there was a toxic cocktail of bad loans, financial mismanagement, and regulatory blind spots. In the blink of an eye, it all came crashing down. The subprime mortgage crisis snowballed into a global recession that wiped out jobs, savings, and entire industries. The collapse was so sudden and devastating that it became a wake-up call for economists and policymakers worldwide. Fast forward to 2024, and the situation feels unsettlingly familiar. Today, the global economy is once again showing signs of growth. According to the International Monetary Fund, IMF, global growth is projected at 3.1% in 2024, a positive headline that suggests resilience. But dig deeper, and you'll find that the economic foundations supporting this growth are precarious at best. Like the housing bubble that burst in 2008, today's apparent stability masks underlying weaknesses that could trigger a far more significant downturn than any we've seen in recent memory. One of the key factors driving this fragile growth is the Federal Reserve's aggressive interest rate policies. Over the past year, the Fed has been on a mission to tame inflation, raising interest rates at a pace not seen since the 1980s. While this has helped slow the rapid rise in prices, it has also made borrowing significantly more expensive. For businesses, this means higher costs to finance operations, invest in new ventures, or even stay afloat. For consumers, it means higher mortgage rates, increased credit card interest, and dwindling purchasing power. Let's break this down further. Imagine you're a small business owner trying to expand your operations. Last year, you could have secured a loan with a relatively low interest rate, allowing you to invest in new equipment, hire more staff, and boost productivity. Today, that same loan would come with a much higher interest rate, meaning your monthly payments would eat into your profits. This squeeze on businesses is happening across the board, particularly in industries with low margins like restaurants and retail. Many businesses are being forced to put expansion plans on hold or, worse, shut down entirely due to the financial pressure. Homeowners are also feeling the impact of these rising rates. In the U.S., mortgage rates have surged to levels not seen in over a decade. For someone looking to buy a home today, the cost of borrowing could be double what it was just a few years ago. This has effectively priced many potential buyers out of the market, leading to a slowdown in the housing sector. And it's not just new buyers who are affected. Existing homeowners with variable rate mortgages are seeing their monthly payments skyrocket, straining household budgets and forcing cutbacks in other areas of spending. This reduced consumer spending ripples through the economy, hurting businesses that rely on discretionary income. But here's where it gets even more concerning. These economic pressures are occurring against a backdrop of global uncertainty. Geopolitical tensions, trade wars, and supply chain disruptions are adding layers of complexity to an already fragile economic situation. For example, the ongoing U.S.-China trade war has led to tariffs on billions of dollars worth of goods, raising costs for businesses and consumers alike. Similarly, conflicts in the Middle East have led to fluctuations in global oil prices, adding further strain to businesses dependent on energy. These external factors, combined with internal economic pressures, create a perfect storm of uncertainty. At the same time, while inflation has been slowing, it's important to note that it hasn't disappeared. Core inflation, which excludes volatile food and energy prices, remains stubbornly high in many countries, including the United States. This means that while the prices of everyday goods may not be rising as rapidly as they were in 2022, they're still increasing. For the average consumer, this translates to continued financial strain. Wages have not kept pace with inflation, leading to a decline in real income and purchasing power. But it's not just about numbers. The human toll of economic instability is significant. During the Great Recession, millions of people lost their jobs, homes, and savings. Entire communities were devastated, particularly those dependent on industries like manufacturing, real estate, and construction. If the economic foundations we're standing on today continue to weaken, we could see a repeat of this kind of devastation, but on a potentially larger scale. As we move forward, it's essential to recognize that what we're facing isn't just a traditional economic downturn. It's a fundamental shift in how the global economy functions, driven by technological change, geopolitical uncertainty, and the long-lasting effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. What's coming isn't just a recession, it's a restructuring of the global economic order. And the question we need to ask ourselves is, are we prepared for the consequences? In the next section, we'll take a closer look at one of the most significant drivers of this economic fragility: consumer debt. How did we get here, and what does it mean for the future of the economy? Stick around, because the answers to these questions are critical to understanding the full scope of the crisis we're facing. Consumer debt, the elephant in the room. Let's dive deeper into the growing mountain of consumer debt, a silent but deadly force in the modern economy. Debt isn't inherently bad. In fact, it's a cornerstone of modern finance. Without it, most people wouldn't be able to buy homes, start businesses, or go to college. But when debt spirals out of control, it becomes a ticking time bomb that threatens not just individuals, but the entire economy. As of 2024, U.S. household debt has reached unprecedented levels. Total household debt has exceeded $17 trillion, an all-time high. This debt includes mortgages, credit cards, student loans, auto loans, and personal loans, with credit card debt alone surpassing $1 trillion for the first time in history. To put this into perspective, every U.S. household owes an average of over $155,000. These are staggering numbers, and they signal a broader economic issue. Americans are living on borrowed money, and the cost of servicing that debt is rising rapidly. Let's break this down. Credit card debt is particularly worrisome. Unlike mortgages or student loans, which typically come with lower fixed interest rates, credit cards often carry interest rates of 20% or higher. With recent interest rate hikes, those rates are climbing even higher. This means that many Americans are paying hundreds, if not thousands of dollars in interest each month. Money that could otherwise be spent on necessities or saved for emergencies. Worse, credit card debt is often used to cover day-to-day expenses like groceries, gas, and utilities, meaning that many people are going into debt just to keep up with their basic living expenses. This kind of debt isn't just a burden for individual households. It's a major drag on the overall economy. When people are overwhelmed by debt, they cut back on spending. And when consumer spending, which accounts for about 70% of the U.S. economy, slows down, businesses suffer. This is already happening in the restaurant industry, where chains like Red Lobster and Applebee's have been closing locations due to declining foot traffic and rising costs. But it's not just restaurants. Retailers, service providers, and entertainment venues are all feeling the pinch as consumers tighten their belts. The debt crisis isn't just about credit cards, though. Student loans are another significant contributor to household debt. In 2023, outstanding student loan debt in the U.S. reached nearly $1.8 trillion, affecting over 43 million borrowers. With the recent resumption of student loan payments after a 3-year pause during the COVID-19 pandemic, millions of Americans are now facing the additional burden of repaying these loans on top of their existing financial obligations. For many, this means making difficult choices. Do they pay off their student loans, keep up with credit card payments, or cover their rent and utilities? This is where the real danger lies. When households are forced to choose between paying off debt and covering essential expenses, the risk of default increases. And when defaults rise, it's not just individual credit scores that take a hit. The broader economy suffers. Banks and lenders become more cautious, tightening their lending standards and making it harder for businesses and consumers to access credit. This, in turn, leads to slower economic growth, job losses, and, eventually, recession-like conditions. It's a vicious cycle, one that becomes harder to break the longer it continues. What makes this situation even more precarious is that wages have not kept up with inflation. While inflation has been slowing in recent months, the cost of living remains significantly higher than it was just a few years ago. Housing, healthcare, food, and energy costs have all risen dramatically, putting additional strain on household budgets. In fact, real wages adjusted for inflation, have stagnated over the past decade, meaning that even though people are working harder and earning more in nominal terms, their purchasing power has not kept pace with rising prices. To illustrate just how serious this issue is, consider the following. In 2023, the average monthly mortgage payment for a new home buyer was over 50% higher than it was in 2019 due to rising interest rates and home prices. For renters, the situation isn't much better. Nationally, rents have increased by an average of 15% over the past 2 years, with some cities seeing even steeper hikes. Add to this the rising costs of food, healthcare, and education, and it's clear that many Americans are struggling to make ends meet. But the problem of consumer debt isn't confined to the U.S. globally. Household debt has been rising in many developed countries, including Canada, the UK, and Australia. In these countries, like in the U.S., households are taking on more debt to cope with stagnant wages and rising costs. This global trend suggests that the problem isn't just a local one, it's a systemic issue that could have far-reaching consequences for the global economy. What does this mean for the future? If consumer debt continues to rise while wages remain stagnant, we could be heading toward a major financial crisis. In many ways, the current situation mirrors the lead-up to the 2008 financial crisis, when excessive debt and risky lending practices led to a housing market collapse and a global recession. The difference this time is that the debt isn't confined to one sector, like housing. It's spread across the entire economy, from credit cards to student loans to auto loans. As we move forward, it's crucial to understand that the consumer debt crisis isn't just a financial issue, it's a societal one. It affects everything from job security to mental health to the stability of communities. And if we don't address it soon, the consequences could be dire. In the next second, we'll explore how global geopolitical tensions are adding fuel to this already volatile situation, creating a perfect storm that could lead to a crisis far worse than a typical recession. Stay with us, because understanding these risks is key to preparing for what lies ahead. Geopolitical tensions, the global wild card. To fully appreciate the fragile state of the global economy, we need to step back and examine the geopolitical landscape. If economic factors like debt and inflation are the cracks in the foundation, geopolitical tensions are the earthquakes that can shake everything apart in an instant. These tensions are unpredictable, multifaceted, and, most importantly, they transcend borders, affecting not only local economies, but also the global financial system. In today's interconnected world, a political crisis in one region can send shockwaves across continents, and the economic fallout can be devastating. Imagine, for instance, the trade wars between the U.S. and China that have dominated headlines over the past few years. What began as a series of tariffs and retaliatory measures has now escalated into a broader economic standoff, affecting everything from technology to agriculture. In the past, economic conflicts were often limited to specific industries or regions, but today, thanks to globalization, these conflicts spread like wildfire. The tariffs imposed by the U.S. on Chinese goods, and vice versa, have disrupted supply chains around the world, affecting businesses in Europe, Asia, and even Latin America. The result? Higher costs for businesses and consumers, decreased economic growth, and a growing sense of uncertainty in the global markets. But the U.S.-China trade war is just one example. In the energy sector, ongoing tensions in the Middle East continue to create instability. The region has long been a hotbed of conflict, and disruptions to oil production there can cause global energy prices to spike overnight. For instance, when geopolitical tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia flare up, the resulting uncertainty can send oil prices soaring, putting pressure on industries that rely heavily on energy, such as manufacturing and transportation. Rising energy costs trickle down to the consumer level, leading to higher prices for everyday goods and services. The ripple effect of a regional conflict can thus be felt by people far removed from the actual events. A more recent example is the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, which has thrown global energy and agricultural markets into turmoil. Russia is a major global energy supplier, and Ukraine is one of the world's largest producers of grain. The conflict disrupted the supply of oil, gas, and food, leading to energy crises in Europe and food shortages in parts of Africa and the Middle East. The sanctions imposed on Russia by Western nations further complicated matters, pushing global prices even higher and exacerbating inflation. This has had a direct impact on everything from gas prices at the pump to the cost of bread in your local grocery store. It's a stark reminder of how interconnected and vulnerable the global economy truly is. Let's take a step back and consider the broader implications of these conflicts. Each geopolitical tension introduces uncertainty into the global economy, making it harder for businesses to plan for the future. When companies are unsure of what will happen next, whether a trade war will escalate, whether a region will descend into war, or whether supply chains will be disrupted, they become more cautious. Investments are delayed, expansion plans are put on hold, and hiring slows. This creates a feedback loop of economic stagnation that can last for years. But beyond trade wars and regional conflicts, there is another layer of geopolitical risk that is even harder to predict: the rise of populism and political instability in many parts of the world. From the U.S. to Europe to Latin America, populist movements have gained ground in recent years, challenging established political and economic systems. These movements often reject globalization, advocate for protectionist policies, and push for sweeping changes that can destabilize markets. For example, the Brexit referendum in 2016 threw the entire European economy into uncertainty as businesses scrambled to figure out what the UK's departure from the European Union would mean for trade, regulation, and investment. Populist movements can also lead to unpredictable policy shifts that make it difficult for businesses to operate. When a government suddenly decides to impose new tariffs, nationalize an industry, or pull out of a trade agreement, it can send markets into a tailspin. Investors who crave stability and predictability may pull their money out of these countries, leading to capital flight and economic downturns. This is why political stability is so crucial for economic growth, and why rising populism is a red flag for many economists and investors. The impact of these geopolitical risks extends far beyond the countries directly involved. Thanks to globalization, the world's economies are more interconnected than ever before. A disruption in one part of the world can quickly spread to other regions, creating a domino effect of economic instability. For example, the trade tensions between the U.S. and China don't just affect those two countries. They impact global supply chains that involve hundreds of other nations. Similarly, an energy crisis in the Middle East doesn't just drive up fuel prices in the region. It affects energy prices worldwide, influencing everything from manufacturing costs to airline ticket prices. Let's not forget the role of technology in amplifying these risks. In today's digital world, cyber attacks have become a new form of geopolitical warfare. State-sponsored hackers can target critical infrastructure, financial systems, and even government institutions, causing widespread economic damage. For instance, a major cyber attack on a country's power grid or banking system could cause chaos, leading to disruptions in trade, financial markets, and even social stability. As nations become more reliant on technology, the risks of cyber warfare grow, adding yet another layer of complexity to the geopolitical landscape. But here's the critical point. These geopolitical tensions aren't just background noise. They are active, growing threats that are influencing the global economy in real time. As we continue, we'll explore how these global dynamics interact with domestic issues like consumer debt and sector-specific crises, creating a perfect storm that could lead to an economic downturn far worse than a typical recession. Stay tuned, because understanding these dynamics is crucial to preparing for what lies ahead. The domino effect: how sectoral crises can spread. Let's imagine for a moment that you're in a room filled with rows of dominoes. You carefully place them one after another, each representing a sector of the economy: restaurants, retail, real estate, manufacturing, and so on. At first, everything seems stable, but it only takes one small push, a single domino falling, and the entire line begins to collapse. This image captures the precarious nature of today's interconnected economy. A crisis in one sector can quickly ripple outward, toppling others and sparking a chain reaction that is incredibly difficult to stop once it begins. This is exactly the scenario we're facing today. The restaurant industry is already being hit hard, and this is just the beginning. Rising food prices, the ongoing shift to remote work, and declining foot traffic in urban areas are forcing once thriving restaurants to close their doors. While this might seem like an isolated issue affecting only one sector, the reality is that the restaurant industry's struggles are a canary in the coal mine, signaling deeper problems that could soon spread to other sectors. Restaurants are often seen as the backbone of local economies, particularly in urban centers. When they close, it's not just their employees who suffer. Suppliers lose business, landlords lose tenants, and adjacent businesses like retail shops and service providers see a drop in foot traffic. Consider how closely the restaurant industry is linked to the broader economy. When a restaurant shuts down, the effects trickle out in every direction. Food suppliers, many of whom are already operating on razor-thin margins, lose key clients, which can lead to layoffs or closures of their own. Landlords, particularly those in urban areas, are left with vacant spaces that are difficult to fill in a post-pandemic world where many businesses are downsizing their physical footprints. This in turn leads to falling commercial real estate prices, which can affect banks and investors who have heavily invested in these properties. Let's take this further. Imagine a major restaurant chain like Applebee's or Red Lobster closes multiple locations across the country. Now, thousands of employees are out of work, and many of them may have been relying on their jobs to support their families. With few people employed, consumer spending, the lifeblood of the U.S. economy, begins to slow. People without jobs don't go out to eat, don't shop as much, and don't invest in big-ticket items like cars or electronics. This reduced spending impacts the retail sector, which is already struggling due to competition from e-commerce giants like Amazon. Retailers begin closing stores, leading to even more layoffs and further reductions in consumer spending. The domino effect continues. Now, let's add the housing market into the equation. In many cities, especially in densely populated urban areas, restaurants are often anchor tenants in mixed-use developments. These developments typically include residential units, retail spaces, and office buildings. When restaurants close, the desirability of living or working in these areas declines. If people are no longer drawn to a neighborhood because its once thriving restaurant scene has dried up, property values can fall. This not only affects homeowners and landlords, but also banks and investors who have heavily invested in real estate. A collapse in the housing market can then have far-reaching consequences for other sectors. Construction companies, for example, might slow down or halt new projects due to falling demand for housing and commercial real estate. This affects not only construction workers, but also suppliers of building materials, architects, engineers, and other professionals in related fields. The transportation and logistics sectors also take a hit, as there's less need to move goods and materials when new construction slows down. Manufacturing is another sector that could be hit hard by this domino effect. When consumers stop spending on non-essential goods, things like electronics, cars, and appliances, manufacturers are forced to cut back on production. This can lead to factory closures, layoffs, and a slowdown in the transportation sector, as there are fewer goods to ship. And when manufacturing slows down, it's not just the companies producing the goods that suffer. Suppliers of raw materials, logistics companies, and even advertising firms that rely on consumer products for revenue all feel the pain. The transportation industry, particularly freight and logistics companies, is often seen as the backbone of global commerce. If goods aren't being manufactured or sold, there's less demand for transportation services. Trucking companies, shipping lines, and air freight services could all see a decline in business, leading to layoffs and bankruptcies in an industry that already operates with thin margins. The energy sector is yet another industry that could be affected by the domino effect. When manufacturing slows down and fewer goods are being transported, the demand for energy decreases. This can lead to a drop in oil and gas prices, which might seem like a good thing for consumers at first, but can devastate energy companies, particularly those that rely on high prices to fund operations. In oil-rich regions like the Middle East and parts of the U.S., a drop in energy prices can lead to significant economic downturns, resulting in job losses and a decline in government revenue. But perhaps the most alarming aspect of this domino effect is how quickly it can spread across borders in today's globalized economy. A crisis that starts in the U.S. can easily spread to Europe, Asia, and beyond. For example, many European and Asian economies rely heavily on exporting goods to the U.S. When American consumers stop buying, factories in China, Germany, and Japan produce fewer goods, leading to layoffs and slowdowns in those countries. In a globalized world, no economy is isolated, and a slowdown in one major region can have ripple effects across the globe. In the next section, we'll explore what steps you can take to protect yourself from the fallout of this potential crisis. The dominoes may already be falling, but there are strategies you can employ to safeguard your financial future. Stay tuned, because understanding how to navigate these turbulent times is key to not only surviving, but thriving in the face of economic uncertainty. Preparing for the unprecedented. What you can do. Facing the potential for an economic crisis that could be worse than a traditional recession is daunting, but the key to weathering the storm is preparation. The good news is that there are practical steps you can take to protect yourself and your family from the economic fallout. These strategies aren't just about surviving, they're about positioning yourself to thrive even in the most challenging times. Let's break down what you can do to safeguard your financial future. Reassess your financial situation. The first step in preparing for an economic downturn is to take a close, honest look at your financial situation. Start by evaluating your current income, expenses, and debt. If you're carrying a significant amount of debt, whether it's credit card debt, student loans, or a mortgage, now is the time to develop a plan to pay it down. High-interest debt, in particular, can become a massive burden in an economic crisis. As interest rates continue to rise, the cost of servicing this debt will only increase. Focus on paying off debt with the highest interest rates first, such as credit card balances. This will free up more of your income for savings and essential expenses in the long run. In addition to tackling debt, take a hard look at your spending habits. Are there areas where you can cut back? Many people find that during periods of economic uncertainty, they need to shift from discretionary spending to essential spending. This doesn't mean you have to sacrifice your quality of life, but it does mean prioritizing needs over wants. For example, instead of splurging on luxury items or frequent dining out, focus on saving and investing in things that provide long-term value, such as home repairs, education, or professional development. Build an emergency fund. An emergency fund is your first line of defense in an economic downturn. If you don't already have one, now is the time to start building it. Financial experts generally recommend having 3 to 6 months' worth of living expenses saved in a liquid, easily accessible account. This money should be used only in case of true emergencies, such as job loss, medical expenses, or unexpected home repairs. An emergency fund provides a crucial cushion during times of financial instability. In a worst-case scenario, such as a job loss or sudden reduction in income, it can help you avoid taking on additional debt to cover basic expenses like rent, utilities, and groceries. And in an economic crisis, having readily available cash can be a lifesaver. If you already have some savings, consider increasing your emergency fund. Given the potential for long-term economic instability, you may want to aim for 6 months to a year's worth of expenses, especially if you're in a particularly vulnerable industry. Diversify your investments. One of the most important strategies for protecting your wealth during an economic downturn is diversification. When the economy takes a hit, certain assets, such as stocks, particularly in specific sectors, can lose significant value. By diversifying your investments, you reduce the risk of losing everything if one particular asset class performs poorly. Start by examining your current investment portfolio. Are all your assets tied up in a single sector, such as tech stocks, or in a single asset class, like equities? If so, it's time to diversify. Consider spreading your investments across a variety of asset classes, such as stocks, bonds, real estate, and commodities like gold or silver. Precious metals, for example, are often seen as a safe haven during times of economic uncertainty, as their value tends to hold steady or even increase when markets are volatile. Additionally, consider investing in inflation-protected assets. In times of rising inflation, certain investments, like Treasury inflation-protected securities, TIPS, real estate, or even certain types of infrastructure investments, can offer protection against the eroding purchasing power of cash. These assets tend to increase in value as inflation rises, helping to preserve your wealth. If you're not sure where to start, consult with a financial advisor who can help you assess your risk tolerance and recommend a diversified portfolio that aligns with your long-term financial goals. Stay adaptable. Skills, careers, and side hustles. In an economic downturn, adaptability is key. The job market can shift rapidly, with layoffs becoming more common in certain sectors, while other industries see increased demand. To protect yourself, it's important to remain flexible and open to new opportunities. This might mean developing new skills, changing industries, or even starting a side hustle to generate additional income. If you're currently working in an industry that's particularly vulnerable to economic downturns, such as hospitality, retail, or real estate, it may be worth considering how you can pivot to a more resilient field. Technology, healthcare, and essential services tend to be more stable during times of crisis. So now might be the perfect time to invest in education or training that allows you to transition into one of these industries. Upskilling in areas like data analysis, programming, or healthcare administration can significantly increase your job security and open new doors. Starting a side hustle can also be an effective way to diversify your income streams. Whether it's freelancing, selling products online, or offering consulting services, having a secondary source of income can provide financial stability and help you build savings faster. The key is to choose something that aligns with your skills and interests, while also addressing a market need. Monitor the economic environment. Staying informed is one of the most powerful tools you have in an uncertain economy. By keeping up with economic news, trends, and forecasts, you can anticipate changes before they happen and make informed decisions. This might include staying on top of Federal Reserve decisions on interest rates, monitoring inflation trends, or following industry-specific news that could impact your job or investments. It's also important to stay aware of potential geopolitical risks, as they can have significant economic consequences. Trade wars, military conflicts, and political instability can all disrupt markets and supply chains. So staying informed about global events is crucial for understanding how they might impact your financial situation. To stay informed, make a habit of reading reliable financial news sources, subscribing to newsletters from trusted economic analysts, or even attending webinars and conferences on economic trends. This will give you a clearer picture of where the economy is headed and allow you to adjust your financial strategies accordingly. As we wrap up, remember that preparation is key. While no one can predict exactly what the future holds, taking steps to secure your financial well-being now will give you peace of mind and the flexibility to navigate whatever comes next. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on economic insights and tips to protect yourself in these unpredictable times. Together, we can face the challenges ahead with confidence and resilience.